All right. I want to welcome everybody to our Places of Worship forum. Let me go ahead and stop that screen and music from playing, and we'll go ahead and begin just shortly. We've got 3 presenters here today with us, and we'll be covering some great topics for you. Let me go ahead and get the agenda. All right. So to begin our Place of Worship forum today, we're going to have an opening message from our mayor and also from one of our commanders here in the town of Paradise Valley. So I want to introduce Mayor Jerry Bean Wilner, if you'd like to turn on your mic.
Here I am.
All right, perfect. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Officer McGee. It's a delight to be with you all. I want to welcome, first of all, I want to thank our police department for doing this. Chief Winger, Commander Cole, I know you're here, Officer McGee, and everybody who works very hard with the faith community and with the entire group of residents and visitors and people who travel through our town. Your work is greatly appreciated, especially during these challenging times. We're very happy that our police department has connected with Mr. Kevin Smith and Matthew Hackner, and also with Susan Schneider, Ms. Susan Schneider, all federal law enforcement folks who have some great information for you. And I'm just as excited as you are to hear that. I just wanted to take a moment to the representatives of our faith community to thank you for everything that you're doing during this pandemic. I know you're a tremendous source, and your congregations are a tremendous source of support for people in our community, and that's greatly appreciated. I also wanted to personally thank you for the efforts and cooperation that each of you have engaged in to try to do the best we can during tough times with the health crisis and many other difficulties to sustain health and peace and wellness for everybody. And I would say on a personal note and without violating any crossing any lines, I'd say I know you're all people of faith and people of prayer, and I'd say keep the prayers and good deeds and good works coming, and know that they're always appreciated by me and all of us in town leadership and among town staff. So just grateful for you all participating, really excited to hear from the panelists and from our excellent police department. And with that, I will say thanks again, everyone, for participating. Last but not least, if something does come up within your communities that needs attention from council, in your opinion, or you just want to share information, obviously always feel free to reach out to our police department and staff. And each and every one of you are welcome to contact me whenever you think it's appropriate or necessary. So glad you're all here, and thanks again, Officer McGee.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'd like to also introduce our commander, Michael Cole. He has a couple words to share with you as well.
Well, good evening. I wanted to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule to attend this important forum. Chief Winger sends his regards. He wishes he could be here with you, but he was unfortunately double booked tonight. To start off, I'd like to say thank you to the Office of Partnership and Engagement with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security for their collaboration with the Paradise Valley Police Department. Tonight's forum with panelists of experts would not have been possible without their dedication to the safety of our entire community. Tonight's forum has diverse representation from 18 distinct faith-based organizations, 11 of whom are within the town of Paradise Valley, and 3 others from within the vicinity of the Valley of the Sun. We value your presence and your dedication to improve our community safety from discussions that take place within these forums. With that, I will now pass it over to our Community Resource Officer, Stephen McGee, to share more details on tonight's forum.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a poll today. I'm going to send one out, and I was curious. I'm going to launch this right now. And this polling right here is asking how many of our faith-based organizations are using some form of outreach through online communications. This could be through email, could be through social media. It could be any other online activity that you're doing. If you have the chance to vote, if you're unaware, you can put unknown. if you're aware that you're using something, you click yes. And so we'll give a little bit of time for people to respond. We've got 9 of 24 people so far have responded. All right, and I'm not sure if you can see the percentages that I see in front of me. I have about 79% of people say yes, they are using some form of outreach through online communication. So I just wanted to find out how many people were aware, if they were using or weren't, so that way we could make sure we were just aware of that. I have got another question also for everybody. This polling question here is for cybersecurity, and I'm going to go ahead and launch this one. It is, what is your initial impression of cybersecurity? Do you have any, do you have no apparent concerns? Do you have some type of cybersecurity concerns, or have you actually experienced cybersecurity issues at your places of worship, or maybe something other? And I'm just kind of curious, that way we can kind of see what our audience has experienced. All right. We've got just about over half the people have responded, and it looks like they have some, 62% have some type of cybersecurity concern. And then we've got 29% have experienced some type of cybersecurity issue. So perfect. I just wanted to find out, again, who our audience was, what type of experience you guys have had with cybersecurity before we go into our presentation. So thank you guys so much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it over to the Director of Homeland Security, Center of Faith and Opportunity Initiatives, Kevin Smith.
Officer McGee, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can. I've got a few slides in. If you'll give me 2 seconds to pull that up. You see that there? Are we good?
Yep, we're good. And I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions during the presentation, if you want to send them through the chat message here, or if you're not able to do that for any reason, I do have my email available as well. And so I'll be checking my email. Either way, if you have questions, please submit them. And at the end of the form, we'll go ahead and we'll start to tackle the different topics that were addressed. And hopefully we'll talk about all the different concerns you may have. So thank you so much. And Kevin, if you want to continue.
Thank you. And let me just start off by saying greetings on behalf of the White House Faith and Opportunity Initiatives. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but on behalf of the DHS Secretary and Assistant Secretary John Hill, I want you to know from a personal and a professional relationship the value that the administration within DHS, the people who are on this call, how much we value the work of the faith community. I joined the administration in 2018 as the DHS Center for Faith and Opportunity Initiatives Director within DHS, obviously. I've had the privilege to travel all over the country. I've met with many faith leaders and talked to them about the work they do and how they serve in their communities. I kind of have to cheat here and tell you I have the answers to the test because I am a preacher's kid. I grew up in our faith community. I actually was a preacher's kid in the Salvation Army, and that came from a lot of my background. So when I am with pastors and church leaders of all types, I am in my sweet spot. So if I get a little excited, a little over too much energy on here, or get a little loud, I apologize. But it really is where a passion I have, because I grew up and worked with houses of worship throughout my entire emergency management career before I came to serve in the administration. And I know how faith-based organizations serve the community, not only in meeting the everyday emotional and spiritual care of their congregations, but they serve in ways in the community, whether it's a soup kitchen or maybe a food pantry, perhaps it's schools, or maybe your house of worship runs a clinic or in some other way. What we know is the power of the faith community is often taken for granted. and the leadership and the trust that congregations have in their pastors, in their faith leaders, can't be taken for granted. And that's one of the reasons that, established by executive order, that the White House has a Faith and Opportunity Initiative. And there's actually 12 of me across the federal government in each one of these agencies. And we report through the secretaries as they lead these administrations and coordinate in working with our local organizations. There's a lot of programs and a lot of tools that we want to make sure we get into your hands to be able to support the great work that you do. One of the things you're going to hear about as we talk about from different perspectives, but to know within the Department of Homeland Security, where my office sits, we have Custom and Immigration Services, we have the Coast Guard, Customs and Border Protection, CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. There's a lot of these words that are going to maybe overwhelm you with all the agencies that represent under this. My desk actually sits in the last of those, which is actually in the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And that's ultimately, if I said I had a sweet spot in working with faith community, I actually was a director for 23 years for the emergency disaster response within the organization I grew up in, the Salvation Army. So I came to this job in working in ways to support the administration, largely in emergency management. But when I joined, what I quickly found was above and beyond the work in emergency in times of disaster, but it was the work that faith-based organizations do along the border in the humanitarian crisis that we have had, and many of you know very well, over the past couple of years, and where churches stepped in and helped and comforted people who were hurting as they were given dreams of milk and honey, and then left many on the border with no clothes, nowhere to go, and they were caught up in the challenges that they faced when they came to America with maybe nowhere to end up. And yet, houses of worship stepped up and cared for people in humanitarian aid. And I'm going to flip for a second, but I just want to make sure people understand why we engage with faith communities. Even in today's society, where if we read a report, you'll feel that people will say that the United States is falling away from religion, and there may be a little bit of numbers movement, but still 74% of Americans are still affiliated with a religious tradition. Working in a Skype or a Zoom environment is hard, because when I tell this next expression, I'm usually get some chuckles from the pastors because they understand this, those faith leaders that can identify, even if those 74% that affiliate with a religion are only Creasters, those that only come at Christmas and Easter, they still cling to a house of worship and say that they are connected. And I think that's important when we look across the United States of how we relate and how the power of the faith community, even though there's this statement that says that many people are no longer connected, 74% still say they are. And of 60% of those Americans, or the ones that were interviewed in this Pew Research, said they turn first to their religious leaders for advice and direction after a disaster. Now, a lot of times I'm telling this story and I'm talking to houses of worship well before COVID, and people are saying, well, I don't know if they'll come to us. I don't know what disaster we're going to have or what event we're going to have. But in this last year, everywhere in America can identify how people came to their houses of worship to find direction. Now, obviously, a lot of us couldn't do that in our virtual environment as we social distance. Many folks, we weren't worshiping in houses of worship, but they still were on their phone to their faith leaders, and they turned to them for advice. And we saw that this year probably more than ever. And what's interesting is faith leaders didn't back off. They stepped in, they leaned in, and them and their congregations leaned in, especially to serve many of these that we would consider the least of these, that are our vulnerable populations who were on the threshold before the disaster, and houses of worship stepped up in that space without question. And then we talk about, how do we communicate? How do we talk about building a resilient community? We're going to talk about, have some awesome speakers that are going to follow me much better than I. But when we talk about educating and getting the word out, we always talk about, well, we should do it in our schools. We should make schools put a curriculum of how do we talk to kids about disaster preparedness and resilience. But there's only 105,000 schools or universities across the country, and there's 345,000 congregations. So the starting of this slide talks about why should we engage faith communities? Why did the mayor, and I thank you, Mayor, for having us on here, but why does he invested in faith-based organizations and outreach, and Officer McGee? It's because you overwhelm the resources in the community, from facilities to relationships to resources. And that is something that good community leadership doesn't take for granted. And I'm honored to be on this panel and talking to you all and hear the leadership of this committee in working with the faith-based organizations. I'm going to take a real quick second to talk to you about how FEMA looks at this and part of the FEMA strategic plan, because this is really important as it shows the role of faith-based organizations. When we talked about FEMA, is we have to build a culture of preparedness. We have to ready the nation for catastrophic disasters. Little did we know when this was developed in 2018, we'd be facing a pandemic that hit every zip code across the nation. But also in the third part, our third strategic objective is to reduce the complexity of FEMA and the federal government and the resources that can help people to recover. But I want to focus on these two red areas that I have highlighted real quick. Folks often take for granted the power of the pulpit or the place at which a house of worship can influence a community, their community. One of the things, obviously, in the eastern part of the United States, they're all worried about flood insurance and what we don't have when it comes to what our insurance actually says it covers. Out west, you may look more at what does your homeowner's insurance cover when you look at earthquakes or other hazards that you may be exposed to, or wildfire damage that may impact your home, which is very relevant today. And what we find is most people don't even know really what their insurance is. And if you're like me, you probably were championed on the closing, hey, you don't have to have this insurance. You don't need flood insurance, even though you live in a city that's called Lando Lakes, Florida. You don't need homeowners insurance. You pass the test. And I know that many of us look at options when they sign their documents on their homes, that they exclude that and they think that that's championing, that's money that they get to save. And yet we find that one of our biggest gaps in the nations and one of the things that causes the most damage after disasters is floods and water. And yet we let people tell us that that's not important and you can save a few dollars here if you don't have it. So what we want to do is we want to talk to leaders. We're talking today about some of the vulnerabilities with our house of worship, with working in a cyber environment, but the role of you as a faith leader in also sharing the message of safety on internet usage, on other activities, even outside of just the church. All of those things are things that they listen to you for. And I'm not going to propose to every pastor that on every Sunday morning, instead of having your Sunday school classes or your instructional classes or your whatever you have within your house of worship, that you need to convert that to disaster training every Sunday. But as a pastor who probably counts on some of the financial wellness of their congregation to keep the doors open, it might be something you want to talk about every now and then. I'm going to flip real quick, and I just want to make sure you understand I am passionate about the work you do. I am passionate about you working in the environment, and I thank you tremendously for how you have worked through COVID in supporting your community and how you will continue to help not only in the resource needs of financial assistance or meals or whatever you have done or found yourself in, but it's the long-term emotional and spiritual care that I know that you will be playing a role in helping your congregations, no matter what faith background you come from, the role that you play in helping lead through these times of recovery, whether it's COVID environment, earthquake, flood, whatever catastrophe you face, you as faith leaders are often placed, and I appreciate the work you have. And I have resources. You can go to two places. You can go to DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, dhs.gov, and I make it really easy for you. It's called dhs.gov/faith. And if you want to go where we have a few more resources, you can go to fema.gov/faith resources. Either way, you'll have options and connection to many of the things you'll talk about today, from disaster planning to safety and security, and some of the tools within our CISA agency that has great tools for you locally as you prepare for those that want to or think they're going to harm a house of worship. They may target you for violence. We have some great tools there, and I just want to make sure we maximize the resources that we have and they put them in your hands. Officer McGee, thank you for letting me be on here. And I know I've probably gone a little bit over what I was supposed to, but as I said, I get very excited in sharing it. And I am very thankful to the mayor and yourself for inviting our team here. And I know we've got some great people who are going to bring you some additional resources as we move through. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And what we're going to do is any resources that are shared within this form, I have your email addresses as attendees. And so I'll forward the emails or the links to any of the resources that were mentioned. So I'll go through all of that for you as well. Let me go and share my screen again. So we've got our next presenter from the Office of Intelligence and Analysis. And this is going to be Senior Intelligence Officer Matthew Hackner.
Okay, see if we get set up here as well. I was actually going to try to start my video just so I could like show my face and say hello, so you know I'm an actual person and not some bot or whatever. It's kind of weird to, you know, be in this virtual environment where we don't have that interpersonal interaction, but you know, such is the way that we've adapted to the pandemic. I have some slides as well. Officer McGee, I'm ready to share my screen whenever you're ready, if that's okay. I'm going to click yes and see if we can make this happen. So, okay, great. All right. Thank you for the dual introductions here. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Matthew Hackner. I'm a Senior Intelligence Officer with the Office of Intelligence and Analysis back in Washington, D.C. My last name is indeed Hackner, and I deal with cybersecurity, and I often get, you know, looks of incredulity, but it is a thing. And it's almost like I was made for this. But I've been with DHS for about 9 years now, and prior to that, spent about 16 years working for the Department of Defense, both as a uniformed military personnel, with military uniformed personnel, and also as a consultant, where I spend most of my time, you know, looking at adversaries overseas and devising ways to thwart some of their nefarious plots and schemes and actually break their infrastructure. And, you know, it's been a really refreshing and kind of heartening experience to work on the other side of the equation for DHS, where we're actually going out of our way to prevent calamities from occurring in the first place. And as you heard Mr. Smith allude to just a minute ago, to empower folks across the country to recover as quickly and as easily as they possibly can. You know, to kind of echo some of the comments you heard earlier, faith-based communities have really stepped up. They've always been a part of our life, but they've really stepped up in recent months as we've kind of navigated through the pandemic and the real societal and cultural changes that have accompanied it. And you know, I do a lot of volunteer work. I'm coming to you actually from Baltimore. It's where I live. You know, Baltimore has been in the news lately, but one thing that rings true about Baltimore is that the best of the city spirit is manifest in its faith-based organizations and congregations. They really do some amazing work in the community and have established themselves as a pillar for support, and in many cases for just food on the table and critical services that rival that of any federal, state, or local entity. So, you know, it's a real honor to be able to help your folks out and help you do what you do, because we realize that that's an essential service, just like anybody, anything else. So we're briefly going to run through some of the cyber threat environment, some of the nefarious actors, and some of the potential threat vectors that are most likely to that you're most likely to encounter as you not only navigate through the pandemic, but presumably move beyond. As I think the new reality here is that we're going to see a lot of the interpersonal, in-person functions of, be it small business, government, and even places of worship, transition to a more of a hybrid format. Frankly, there are a lot of benefits to it: cost savings, ease of use, convenience. You can connect to people around the world. But as we're going to learn here in just a moment, there's some serious vulnerabilities and risks associated with that. So our goal here tonight is to educate you on, make you aware of some of those threats and vulnerabilities, so that you'll be able to better defend against them. So see if hopefully my slides will move forward. A little bit about my organization. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis is one of two dedicated intelligence components within the Department of Homeland Security, Coast Guard being the other. We are actually one of the 17 intelligence community organizations. The others that you'll see in the various logos on the left, depicted on the slide, include the National Security Agency, the FBI, the Central Intelligence Agency, and so on. Our organization, INA, was created by the Homeland Security Act of 2002, specifically to harness the power and the expertise and the insight that those intelligence community organizations can produce, and share that information, translate it into a digestible form, and share that information with folks that can actually do something about it. And that includes the 16 critical infrastructure sectors that have been recognized by the department, state and local governments, and yes, indeed, including faith-based organizations like we have here tonight. We push our intelligence insight through a number of different vehicles. Obviously, online presentations are one method that we do it. We actually prefer to do them in person. Ideally, we'd be in Phoenix or in Paradise Valley right now, enjoying the late summer weather. But that's not possible. So when we can't do that, we will shift online. We'll host teleconferences, and of course, we have a number of other methods whereby we publish our intelligence findings in reports at various classification levels, and we disseminate those to security practitioners around the country. We've increasingly worked with CISA and also FEMA to inform those organizations of the threat environment, and also to partner with them to go out to meet with the critical infrastructure stakeholders to, again, make you aware of some of the threats out there, and then leverage the expertise that CISA and FEMA bring to bear to basically empower you to prevent those from ever affecting you. So let's learn a little bit about some of those threats. And I realize that this slide is crazy for the layperson, and it's crazy for a lot of cybersecurity efforts. And then I could probably talk about it for a couple of hours, but we're not gonna dive that deep into the cyber threat dilemma. I realize that it's a really intimidating problem set to wrap one's head around. We can keep it as simple or complex as you like, but the key on this slide here is that you have a number of threat actor groups or categories that we generally lump all of those bad apples into. The upper tier state actors are the Russian intelligence services, Chinese intelligence services, Iranian paramilitary organizations, and North Korean hackers that work for the North Korean regime. And generally speaking, those big four upper tier state actors can bring to bear some incredibly disruptive or destructive capabilities. Their hackers spend a considerable amount of time and devote a massive amount of resources toward developing tools that are incredibly stealthy and can wreak havoc on even the most sophisticated and secure government or intelligence services networks around the world. They've demonstrated those capabilities time and time again. Most folks have probably heard about some of their rather nefarious activities over the last few years. Again, China hacking to steal intellectual property, North Korean hackers committing cyber criminal activities to fund the regime's nefarious activities, Iran beginning to harass faith-based communities, among others, in the Middle East and beyond. And then, of course, Russia, notorious for, among other things, election meddling and influence activities. they're in a category all their own. And generally speaking, those countries' offensive cyber activities are wedded to their overall national, strategic priorities. Espionage. They you often use their cyber activities as a weapon system of sorts. The general assessment in our office is it's unlikely that they would seek to deliberately target faith-based organization, but we can't rule it out. Particularly in the case of Iran, who obviously has had issues with U.S. foreign policy in recent years. That's something that we definitely can't rule out with Iran. They have a rather robust criminal hacktivist arm that spends a considerable amount of time and energy navigating through social media platforms to connect with people that are like-minded, to support some of their paramilitary activities. That's something that we definitely keep an eye out for. But generally speaking, these four threat actor groups, or these four nation states, probably are not going to deliberately target faith-based organizations. Similarly, the other state actor groups that are slightly less capable, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, countries like that, South Korea even has an offensive cyber program, generally use their cyber programs to augment their foreign policy, intelligence collection efforts, or in some cases, military activities. The two groups that we definitely want to highlight for the purpose of this evening's meeting are cyber criminals and criminal hackers. And oftentimes, these two categories, they sound very similar. The terms can get conflated. You'll often hear them discussed in media reporting almost interchangeably, but for the department's overall cyber threat intelligence effort, we put them into two distinct categories. So cyber criminals are hackers that are primarily seeking financial gain, meaning they're looking to steal money, steal something of value from you, be it your personal information, historically credit card numbers and CVV numbers, bank accounts that are online bank accounts that are poorly secured. But more recently, they've turned to ransomware. And we'll talk a little bit more about ransomware in just a minute. But cyber criminals for many years had targeted financial institutions, but now they've pivoted somewhat to smaller organizations whose cyber defense or network defense posture is considerably lower than those such as banks or major critical infrastructure entities such as energy companies. And that definitely is an item of concern for the faith-based community, because cyber criminals, as we've noted over the last several years, have really shown a propensity to target the weakest of the bunch and hold them and exploit them and extort them for significant ransoms, because they often know that you have very little options to move elsewhere to reconstitute your networks. We'll talk a little bit about that again in just a minute. The other group that I wanted to introduce are criminal hackers. Previously, we would refer to them as hacktivists, but our legal counsel said, no, you cannot call somebody a hacktivist. That may be exhibiting leveraging their First Amendment constitutionally protected rights. It's only an issue if they are crossing the criminal threshold and actually using speech or to intimidate or assault or defame, defile, extort, or in some cases, I said intimidate a minute ago, or in some cases using their cyber tools to actually delete data off of others' networks or websites. And we often would refer to them as those attacks as a web defacement attack, where they may go onto hack into your web server or your host and essentially change the data on your website. And that activity tends to ebb and flow. It generally aligns with the frequency of that activity generally aligns with social issues or cultural issues that are proliferating through media circles. So obviously, the summer we had the George Floyd protests around in July in the Midwest and other cities, we saw a commensurate spike in activity by criminal hacktivists who would move to deface police department websites or other organizations that they believed were not like-minded. Um, and we anticipate that that activity and those activity levels will, if anything, probably increase in the coming months as people continue to become increasingly frustrated with the pandemic response, economic insecurity, and other social issues that may aggrieve them. So again, one wild card to note about criminal hackers is that they're often half kiddingly referred to as the Robin Hoods of the web. They fight for the little guy. They expose or embarrass organizations that may be harming others. But in any case, we look at that activity as illegal. It is illegal to access information that was not meant to be accessible to you, and to alter that data is also a crime. So there's a very fine line between constitutionally protected free speech and criminal hacktivism. Um, but that is something that we believe is of significant concern for faith-based communities, given the amount of cultural and social unrest that we're witnessing around the country right now. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific trends that we've noted over the last several months that I'm concerned may have a direct impact on some of your activities. Um, First and foremost, the post-COVID or the pandemic response environment that we're contending with now, as I mentioned earlier, has really forced many businesses, governments, organizations, individuals, family units around the country to change a lot of their behaviors, to change habits, the way that you do things. I know my kids, I have one child who is actually in a private religious school for the first time. She just started 6th grade. And my other one is in grade school at public school, two completely different learning platforms. One is hybrid, one is strictly online. But in both cases, both schools are essentially, um, you know, ad-libbing the entire process. And last spring when we first began to go into online learning, it was a very steep learning curve for not only students but parents and teachers and administrators alike. And I suspect that many of you on the call tonight can relate to that experience. As Mr. Smith mentioned in his opening statements, I belong to a synagogue. I practice my religion regularly. I haven't been in the building in about 7 months now, which is highly unusual. But we have actually taken to online worship and other means of communication that were really not designed for practicing religion, but have adapted accordingly. The problem with that potential threat or vulnerability associated with that transition is that many of the platforms that we use today, social media platforms, are based on inherent trust, meaning you connect with somebody to join a meeting or to have a teleconference, and you presume that that person is like-minded and well-intended. But as we've seen in some elementary school settings around the country, a recent event in Florida, outside of Miami, and a couple of other instances of high-profile Zoom bombing events, that hackers and other criminal hacktivists really are out to break that level of trust for a number of different reasons. And that's something that I think is going to take a little bit of adjustment and getting used to. Another mitigating factor, complicating factor rather, is that as we kind of continue to navigate through the pandemic, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty tired. Not just because it's 3 hours ahead on the East Coast time, but people are often working 1, 2, 3 jobs in some cases, doing double or triple duty as stay-at-home parents or educators. Um, People are distracted. They have a lot going on. They're stressed out. They're more susceptible to making mistakes, be it at work, cooking dinner at home, and certainly when they get online. And hackers historically have relied upon that some level of distraction or inattentiveness to take advantage of gaps in cybersecurity for the purpose of getting into your networks or interfering in your teleconferences or your worship sessions or your sessions. That I anticipate will also increase in the coming months as we transition into the darker winter months where people are generally a little bit thrown off by the circadian rhythm changes. We're also adapting to unfamiliar software applications. So again, I would challenge anybody on the call tonight to self-identify that you had already factored Zoom into your regular worship schedule prior to the pandemic. Most places of worship had never really considered that. Some may have had a webcam every once in a while or public-facing website, but we've seen really a rush to get online and share your message and connect with people. But we're using platforms that we really are just wrapping our heads around. My organization in particular was excoriated in media circles a few months ago for publishing an intelligence assessment that actually identified some security gaps associated with Zoom. Zoom's public affairs officials, steadfastly denied that they existed. We stuck by our analysis. Nevertheless, both sides kind of worked together to mitigate some of the threats, but they were basically talking past one another. Zoom was convinced that their platform was secure. We had other reasons to believe it wasn't. But in any case, we had identified some tactics that hackers could use to crash or Zoom bomb calls that Zoom hadn't actually considered previously. So again, we're still beginning to really feel out the functionality and some of the features of these platforms that we're now using to connect to kind of work around that lack of in-person connection. And more importantly, related to that is that oftentimes when we begin to adapt to using a new platform, we default to the most basic form of that platform with the least complicated security protocols, meaning you'll use a default password when you download a new platform or stand up a new website. You want a couple people to be able to work on the website, so you'll set a really easy default password that 4 people can remember. Hackers live for that stuff too. They often target platforms, websites, devices, you name it. And the first thing they do is search for the default password that came with the device. And in many cases, if that doesn't work, they can guess that your password is probably password 123 or PVPD, 2020 for the Paradise Valley Police Department. Please, I really hope that is not your an actual password that you guys are using, but that's an example of just a kind of jiggling the doorknob way to break into a network that a hacker would use. In some instances, they'll deploy more complicated tools that will actually leverage a script called a rainbow table that will try to force a number of random passwords into a login screen on a website. They use these simple tools because they're effective and generally speaking, allow them to do what they want to do. And when they do it, it's usually not for a real beneficial purpose. A couple of things about the cyber threat actors. First and foremost, even the most capable, those nation state actors I referred to in the previous slide, they're generally kind of lazy. They're not inclined to use their more sophisticated tools to get into a network or crash a Zoom call if they don't have to. Again, they'll use those basic tools that have been around in some cases for 10, 12 years, default passwords, things like that. But really, they love to use their cunning against the human element. And by that, I mean by socially engineering their victims, meaning I'm not going to actually try to guess your password when I can probably call you up, initiate a cold call with you to get an idea of when your next when your Sunday mass is, what time it is, and probably learn a little bit about your organization, and then use that insight and that information I get from the phone call to then dupe you into clicking on an email that I'm going to send a few minutes later. And the problem with social engineering, those phishing emails or spear phishing emails that you've heard about, they're almost always effective. Verizon, telecom giant Verizon, comes out with a annual study each year, and they have a rather robust social engineering testing regimen. And the stats have been pretty consistent for the last 8 to 10 years, whereby if a hacker launches 3 phishing emails against a victim, they have about a 98% chance of illicitly accessing that person's account. And once a hacker is able to get you to click on a link or download a file, essentially they've gained illicit access to your system, to your email inbox, and then can move throughout your network from there. And those tactics are wildly effective, and they can be used to leverage to actually initiate a number of really nefarious actions. Um, so we'll talk a little bit more about social engineering. There's been a lot of discussion in recent years about influence operation and information operations. The two terms are somewhat interchangeable. Basically, what you're trying to do is leverage something you know about somebody else, find that weak spot, conversation piece, talking point, to get that person to share with you information that they otherwise wouldn't, and then essentially exploit that somewhat trusted relationship to then dupe the victim into deploying the hacker's tools onto their account. And in many cases, the misinformation activities, some of the fake news that you hear about in the social media, the tweets and whatever, are what we refer to as slow burning social engineering efforts, whereby a fake Twitter user will aggregate or accumulate a number of followers over a course of several months, and then send those followers a link to a website that they think is of interest based on what they know about those followers. And when those followers go to that website, they essentially download malware onto their systems that that hacker behind the social media platform can use to illicitly access their network. And that's a tactic that is applicable to pretty much every critical infrastructure sector across the country. Universities, government agencies, police departments, you name it. Hackers, particularly cyber criminals, have proven to be extremely adept at social engineering. And what they do with the information that they get from your congregants or your staff or administrators has proven to be extremely useful to them to conduct second and third level attacks against other targets as well. I threw in the stock photo there on the slide. What personal information does your Zoom background signal others? If you actually saw the artificial background I have on my Zoom profile, it's a picture of Wrigley Field in Chicago. And I deliberately selected that for the purpose of seeing if anybody could actually identify it. I know that there are a number of Chicago snowbirds in Phoenix, to include many of my friends and family. Hackers love Zoom backgrounds because it actually tells them a lot about the person that they're watching. But they're only going to really know about that. They're only going to have access to that background if they're able to get into your Zoom session in the first place. And we'll talk in a minute. I know Susan's going to follow up in just a minute. We'll talk about some of those cyber hygiene practices that you can use not only for Zoom, but also just for your regular web browsing and some of your day-to-day business practices for your respective organizations. So a couple of those, again, ensure your systems are up to date and patched. And this is a theme that, a recurring theme that you'd hear from pretty much any federal government or private sector cybersecurity organization. Hackers of all persuasions and capabilities love to exploit systems that are not patched, and software and hardware developers such as Microsoft, Google, etc., will push updates and push what we refer to as patches, or fixes to security bugs. They push them so that to basically close the loop or close the door on those security vulnerabilities on your systems. And hackers, almost inevitably, the first thing they do when they try to engage with somebody's network is they look for unpatched systems, because if that patch was not deployed or installed on your computer, chances are your system is ripe for the taking. find the right balance between access and security. And we realize that this is a tremendous challenge, not only during COVID, but for faith-based organizations writ large, because as I mentioned earlier, your relationship with your respective congregations and worshipers is based on trust. Unfortunately, hackers are looking to do nothing but break that trust or exploit that trust. So you have to, you're basically compelled to apply a certain level of security and kind of mistrust with your own congregations to ensure that the right people are gaining access to your services and the things that you have to offer. So a couple of sub bullets within that. Again, don't share Zoom codes on public facing websites or social media platforms. My congregation back here in Baltimore inadvertently did that on their public facing website the first week that we had Sabbath services. And I called up one of the rabbis. I said, that's a no-no, and use an email chain if you have to. But pick a Zoom code that everybody will know, keep it relatively close hold to ensure that only the right people are getting into your sessions. And so too, same goes for social media platforms. Yeah, everybody wants to advertise and get their word out and build that congregation, that group of followers. But you need to be judicious. You need to be very careful to trust and verify the identity of the people that you're essentially letting into your house of worship, be it in person or online. Set a meeting password and create a waiting room. Officer McGee did an awesome job of that earlier this evening. Obviously, I tried to actually show my face. I couldn't do it because he had actually locked it down, which is great. I was kind of disappointed, but that's okay. He's doing exactly what you're supposed to do. Inevitably, you're probably going to have a few congregants, parishioners, what have you, that are annoyed or frustrated with that. Real simple solution, just articulate why you're doing it, and most people will understand. Same goes for screen sharing and screen annotation. That's one of the common tactics that we've seen on Zoom bombs, where you have folks posting illicit activity or illicit messaging, or essentially marking up other people's videos or pictures. Disabling screen sharing and annotation can take care of that problem. And again, if you kick somebody out of your sessions, don't allow them to rejoin. We've had a couple of instances whereby, uh, you know, uh, session leaders were able to kick people out, but they came right back in, and it became this cat and mouse game where essentially the hosts were so distracted that they actually couldn't get it. They couldn't finish the presentations or the meetings that they were going to have, so they essentially had to shut it down. And also be wary. Don't hesitate to actually shut it down if you are bombed by a number of illicit actors or participants. That's something that you just have to be willing to do. Um, Again, I talked about platforms a minute ago. Use tried and true platforms. We've seen a number of enterprising cyber criminals and pranksters and some real malintended folks promoting platform software that can, solve all your problems or whatever. Those are often scams that are uh, not going to deliver as promised. If anything, uh, do your due diligence on that company's website if you're reasonably confident that they exist in the first place. But again, stick with those reputable, tried and true platforms. There are a number of online resources that you can use to vet the identity or the origin of some of the platforms that are out there now, particularly those that deal with social media or advertising, things like that. And again, as always, be wary of solicitation and cold calling. The scammers are out in force, and they've been extremely successful during the course of the pandemic because, again, they've caught people that are off guard, that have let their guard down a little bit. And once they do, they either grab a credit card number, clean out a bank account, or gain illicit access to a network. The cost of the repair and the reconstitution of your network and the amount of time and manpower that you're going to need to take care of the problem will exponentially outweigh the amount of time and resources that you'll need to actually avoid the problem in the first place. And finally, when in doubt, ask us for help. You have a number of awesome resources in your backyard. Obviously, you have your local police department, law enforcement. Most people would think of a local police department as a resource for cybersecurity, but here we are. And kudos to Officer McGee and the rest of the folks in Paradise Valley for having the wherewithal to approach DHS. And you're going to hear a little bit more about some of the products and services that we offer free of charge. I mean, this is literally like your tax dollars at work. We are happy to do this. If we can't do it, you have a number of other resources in your backyard that can do it. The ACTIC, the Arizona Counterterrorism Information Center, which is also known as your Fusion Center in Phoenix, has direct access to not only resources at the state level, but also back in DHS headquarters. Clearly, you can connect with us back in Washington with relative ease. You have a great Fusion Center intelligence officer that belongs to my organization, Brent Wise. He couldn't join us tonight. He is co-located at the ACTIC and he's available. We'll pass along his contact information. And a couple of other things that I just wanted to briefly promote. I mentioned earlier that my organization's goal is to deliver information, share information and insight with you to prevent attacks from occurring in the first place. We do that through a couple of tools that you may or may not have access to. The most significant one being HISN, the Homeland Secure Information Network. And that is a secure portal that hosts a number of communities of interest across a number of security disciplines, both physical, cyber, what have you. That is a great way to connect with some of our unclassified or for official use only level intelligence products that'll keep you up to date on some of the cyber trends and threats that we're observing back in Washington, D.C. And it's another great vehicle by which you can share information with us back in Washington as well. I know that I've bombarded you with a ton of information. Again, if you have the wherewithal to ask a question or share a question, and I admittedly have not been checking while I've been speaking, but I'll do that in just a second. We're happy to take questions. We're happy to connect with you afterward on a one-on-one basis, or reconvene at a later time. But I want to again thank you for everything that you're doing right now, particularly during the pandemic. On behalf of my family back in Baltimore and my extended family back in Arizona, we really appreciate what you do. And on behalf of my colleagues at DHS, we're committed to making sure that you have the tools and resources available that will allow you to do that without interruption. So with that, I will turn it back over to Officer McGee. And thank you so much for your time tonight. And I'm going to stay online to hopefully answer a few more questions in the coming minutes. But thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We've got a couple questions that have begun to be submitted, so please continue to send those in if you've got them during the presentation. The next person that we have to present is from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency. It is Deputy Associate Director of Security Programs, Susan Snyder. And I'm going to also share my screen that I had on just a second ago. Susan, do you need to share a screen by chance, or?
I do not. No,
Okay.
I'll keep this pretty quick to be aware of everyone's time.
All right, you're good to go.
Great. So at the beginning of the webinar, I posted a lot of resources that I'll be talking about from CISA.gov, and also one of them is not CISA.gov, it's stopthinkconnect.org. But as we go down, I didn't want to just read off the hyperlinks, because that would be very time consuming and you would get it anyway. So I just wanted to pass it on to you in the chat. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak in front of you tonight. I appreciate your time so much, and the other speakers were phenomenal. So hopefully I can meet your expectations after those two. But at the Department of Homeland Security, I work for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is known as CISA, as the Acting Deputy Assistant Director for Security Programs. I served in the Air Force for nearly 10 years as a special agent in the Office of Special Investigations. I served in Minot, North Dakota, and Great Falls, Montana. I originally hail from Portland, Oregon. I worked at FEMA for 3 years after that as the liaison to the FBI on consequence management, and then worked at the National Risk Management Center, which is part of CISA, as the Chief of Operational Analysis for 5 years before moving to security programs last October. Our mission at CISA is to defend against the threats of today while working with partners across all levels of government and in the private sector to secure against the evolving risks of tomorrow. Our motto is defend today and secure tomorrow. At CISA, we solve problems by providing technical assistance, security information and education, assisting with training and exercising best practices, and providing mitigation measures. One of our strategic priorities is soft target security, which include protecting houses of worship. This is a daunting security challenge, but we will continue to support our partners to identify, develop, and implement innovative and scalable measures to mitigate the risk at public gathering locations. Many of the services CISA offers are provided through our CISA regions. Regional personnel like Matt Krimble, who's on the line, your protective security advisor, and Mike Letman, your cybersecurity advisor, work with our program offices in Washington, D.C., and with critical infrastructure partners and soft target owners and operators and communities within the regional, state, county, tribal, and local levels. What they do is support preparation, response, and recovery efforts for hazards impacting critical infrastructure. They safeguard soft targets in crowded places. For K through 12, we host the Federal Clearinghouse for School Resources at schoolsafety.gov. We protect houses of worship, active shooter. We provide active shooter preparedness, webinars, and workshops, as well as a lot of different resources that I put into the chat room. We do bombing prevention, vehicular terrorism mitigation, unmanned aircraft systems, threat mitigation. You can find a lot of these at CISA.gov. They also conduct and integrate infrastructure assessments and analysis, including dependencies and cascading effects on all critical infrastructure to influence decision-making at all phases of emergency management. They facilitate information sharing between public and private sector critical infrastructure partners, enhance election infrastructure security and other critical infrastructure cyber systems. And finally, not finally, but of this list, improve situational awareness of cybersecurity risks and incidents. As you've heard previously, many faith-based organizations are vulnerable to cyber attacks due to the types of information they access and store. They are seen as easy targets due to their size and perceived lack of cyber protections. As part of a standard business operations, faith-based organizations collect and store large amounts of personal and financial information from congregants, donors, and employees. This personally identifiable information, PII, can be used to commit identity theft, to steal from bank accounts, and to identify targets for additional exploitation. In addition to cyber actors motivated by financial gain, perpetrators may target houses of worship for ideological reasons. Houses of worship are commonly susceptible to financial exploitation, ransomware, and website defacement. Financial exploitation can be tied to a variety of nefarious methods, including network intrusions that result from phishing and malware. An increasing number of malicious cyber actors use ransomware, which is a type of software designed to deny access to a computer system or data until a fee is paid. In these types of attacks, cyber actors gain access to vulnerable networks and encrypt files before demanding payment. Another potential vulnerability comes in the form of website defacement, wherein a cyber actor gains entry to a network or web server and changes or replaces the website content with their own information. These attacks, which typically feature hateful language or imagery, seek to cause fear and undermine a community's efforts to create interfaith dialogue. Faith-based communities are increasingly victimized by website defacement attacks. Managing cyber risk requires houses of worship to build strong security practices and a culture of cyber readiness by encouraging basic cyber hygiene and data protection throughout your organization. CISA is dedicated to developing and providing faith-based communities with a range of resources aimed at empowering houses of worship to mitigate a range of cyber threats. We offer direct cybersecurity expertise and recommend developing relationships with the regional cybersecurity advisor, that's Mike Letman, to bolster cybersecurity preparedness, risk mitigation, and incident response capabilities. Here are some things that you can do, and here comes a long list of resources. You can refer to CISA's Cyber Essentials for key information regarding organizational cyber readiness. We talked about multi-factor authentication. That comes from Cyber Essentials, as well as several other reports on how important that is. You can visit stopthinkconnect.org to gain other valuable cyber hygiene information. You can stay current on security updates and enable automatic updates whenever possible. There's a link to understanding patches and software updates from US CERT. That link ends in 04-006. Establish rules of behavior for handling and protecting congregant and donor information and other vital data. Consider restricting access or password protecting files and installing software to protect the website and donations platform. You can install antivirus software on all computers and update regularly. You can refer to the guidelines for publishing information online and maintain awareness of information posted on facility websites or social media accounts, including worship and activity schedules. You can consider posting schedules weekly rather than monthly, or restricting schedules to a member portal. A handy resource for this is from US CERT, and it ends with 05-013. Understanding the risks posed by social engineering and implement the procedures outlined in Avoiding Social Engineering and Phishing Attacks. Again, another US CERT report, 04-014. You can consider conducting a self-led CISA cyber resilience review to measure existing security measures and identify areas for improvement. You can refer to the Situational Awareness, Vulnerability Management, and Risk Management CRR resource guides for additional helpful information. Also, your cybersecurity advisor, Mike can give you valuable information as well as help you out with any kind of cyber resilience review or self-assessment. I just offered up his services to you. Familiarize your staff with the basics of website security. Routinely review registrar and domain name system records for all domains. You can refer to the CISA Cyber Insights Mitigate DNS Infrastructure Tampering for more information. And that is the long hyperlink, CISA Insights Cyber Mitigate DNS Infrastructure Tampering. If your organization experiences an incident, please consider reporting any phishing attempts, malware, or identified vulnerabilities through CISA's secure reporting tool or incident reporting system. And there is a link to that at the bottom. Changing lanes a little bit, there is a places of worship self-assessment, more on the physical side, physical security side, that Matt Crimble can help you with, again, offering up his services. But you can also visit the CISA.gov faith-based organization Houses of Worship website, and that provides you the self-assessment tools as well as many other resources that you can use to look at your physical security. I also put on there a CISA.gov coronavirus link, just in case you want to look at some of our guidance or suggestions on opening back up after coronavirus or even during coronavirus. There's a lot of resources there, a lot of cybersecurity resources as well. Really great information. I have to plug my own website, the Hometown Security website. We have many resources on the securing soft target security side, such as insider threat, vehicle ramming mitigation, active shooter workshop participant information. And we also have a Protecting Houses of Worship video that is linked to there on the Houses of Worship side that we just conducted this last year. That is all I have. A lot of resources thrown at you, but it's all really great information to kind of dig around in. There's more on US CERT as well as CISA.gov. So if you want to ask any questions, please let me know. I'll turn it back over to Officer McGee.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We've got a couple questions that have been asked. And if you have other questions, there's a feature on here where you can raise your hand and I can unmute you so you'll be able to speak. So if you want to talk, you can do that as well. Or if you want to submit questions, we can do that as well. So we'll go ahead and we'll start going through some of the questions that were submitted and elaborate on any of the things that we need to hear. So one of the first questions that we received was with Zoom. Zoom has the ability to lock meetings once a meeting has gotten the participants. Does this usually lock out potential for Zoom bombers?
Man, Matt, I don't think you have an answer for that. I'm trying to read through the chat. I am not familiar with that format. And you know, the best I would do is a Google search on that, to be honest with you.
And it
Yeah,
looks like,
I mentioned I tried to keep up with some of the questions. It's an assumption on my part, but it would be kind of the first stopgap measure to ensure that you can't get Zoom bombed. But as I mentioned in the chat window, that assumes, of course, that all of the users that you've already let in are who they say they are. We've heard a number of stories of people impersonating legitimate users, and then they go in, and then at the most incriminating or potentially embarrassing moment, then they self-identify as a Zoom bomber or a prankster or something like that, and do their thing. So yeah, I don't have a specific answer for that, but that's my first initial stab at it.
yeah, it looked like some of the suggestions that were made as far as having a waiting room and approving people to join, those are certain things that you can do to prevent those bombers from getting in the chat room or the meeting or webinar that you'll be hosting. So, all right. Another one of the questions was, have you seen any security issues with the Live Church's church online platform? It's a free church. It's free for churches. They use it at Grace Church, Community Church. Their usage has grown about 1,000-fold since COVID, and they're just curious if we had heard anything about that platform.
So I have not, but I can take that back to the cybersecurity division to try to flesh out that question. Again, I could give you a really quick Google search, but I don't think that's going to meet your needs. And I will get you in touch with the cybersecurity advisor as well in your location.
Yeah, I committed the cardinal sin of actually going to their website, and their website is in pretty rough shape. So I like Susan, I am not witting of any specific vulnerabilities or threats that leverage that platform, but usually, just like you wouldn't go to a store you probably wouldn't frequent a store that has a broken window. I'd be a little bit skeptical of a platform that has a pretty rough looking website. But again, yeah, we can definitely take that for action and try to follow up with you.
Wonderful. Another one of the questions that we have here is, how effective is two-factor or multi-factor authentication on the prevention of unauthorized access to account information? And I think Susan had some good information on this.
Yeah, and I looked at a report that said, you know, all the fantastic things on multi-factor authentication, which is so good to do anyway, but it also said that you need to have other measures in place because, you know, just one thing, it helps, but it doesn't take away all of your risk. And so it mentioned backing up your files, making sure that your antivirus software is up to date, that you're doing patches, that you're doing all these things in order to still maintain your cyber hygiene.
Great. And I read on here that with those multi-factor, let's see if I can find that statement that you had, that a report suggests that multi-factor authentication prevents more than 96 of the bulk phishing attempts and more than 76 of the targeted attacks. So also effectively blocks bot attacks, but there isn't a known bot that can intercept authentication codes. So I thought that was really cool because that's a great way at creating additional security for any platforms that enable that multi-factor authentication. So that might be useful for some people who have platforms that have that available. Another person submitted a question here that says, are there any links I'm thinking that it was home security form, or I'm not sure what all these initials are here, but all the links that were referenced during the presentation, I do have abundance of links and resources that I will follow up with and connect to all the people who are in attendance. So don't worry about writing them down or copying and pasting them anywhere. I'll gather them all and we'll have those available for you. So we'll send that out. Let's see where we are with the next question. Is there any really good antiviral software that you recommend for firewalls, anti-hacking, etc.?
And due to the nature of Department of Homeland Security, we cannot recommend any specific entity. But as Matt had said, that we recommend a US-based security / antivirus product.
I get asked that question a lot as well. And one thing that I've referred people to is look at the Better Business Bureau on that company. You've got people who are reviewing it for its performance, and that's something that you can take into account. You can look at the longevity of that business and reviews from people who have used it, and that can help guide your decision on whether you want to use that service from that company.
Yeah, and I'll just, to be clear, some of the security platforms that were developed and maintained in either Asia or Russia, those firms often have pretty close ties to their respective government security and intelligence agencies, and or are obligated by the respective government's laws to turn over information about subscribers or users, at the whim of those intelligence agencies. So you just have to be careful with who you subscribe to, ensuring, of course, that is a friendly nation and a company that is really on the up and up. And I'd be wary as well of some of the Eastern European companies that reside in countries that historically have had ties to the former Soviet Union. Oftentimes they tend to not respect privacy laws or really not adhere to them at all. That's just something to consider as well.
Another question that I have here is, I always do the invitations to any Zoom meetings with blind carbon copy in emails. Is this best, or does it matter if the email addresses are visible to others?
Matt, do you have anything for that?
Yeah, as a matter of practice, I mean, it's better. It's definitely better than making them all visible. Again, one of the tactics that we've noted a lot of hackers leveraging is typo squatting, whereby they'll randomly pick email addresses or website addresses that closely resemble their intended targets. So the less information that you technically put out there, or the more that you keep it out of others' hands, the better. So that's probably a rather advisable, permissible practice.
And I think along the same lines, it would reduce in phishing attempts. I think that's what Matt was saying too, is that if you don't provide people email addresses, and God forbid that it gets out to a malicious actor, then they don't have all of your contact list right there.
All right, I have a question coming in from John Lehman. I'm going to go ahead and allow your talking if you want to go ahead and try speaking. Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sure
Okay.
can.
I had a question. We were talking about hackers, and in our vast knowledge that we have in our government, and I'm sure that we're never going to hear about everything that the government has in the storehouse for denying people access to our lines. Do we have a pro-defense system going where we would go and find out who's running our hacks on as far as governments go, and try to do something offensive to burn their system up through the lines or anything like that? Or would that be considered an act of war? But then again, they're committing it on us too. So
That's actually a great question, and you highlight one of the real challenges in contemporary cyber warfare, for lack of a better way to put it, whereby attribution is really difficult. So, historically during the Cold War, if the Soviet Union, fired a ballistic missile in the direction of the United States, you knew where it came from. You generally knew the missile type. You knew where it was headed, et cetera, et cetera. You knew the anticipated yield of the warhead and the damage it was going to wreak upon the target. And you typically had a commensurate response, lined up and ready to go.
right,
The problem with cyber operations and hacking today is that it's really the wild, wild west. And the internet has proven to be the great equalizer for everybody from developing nations to decaying or declining nations such as Russia, to enterprising two-bit um, cyber criminals in rural Siberia who, over the course of 4 years, have amassed $3 billion due to ransomware campaigns. Um,
mhm,
it is really difficult to identify who's doing what at any given time. Hackers of all persuasions are extremely adept at, not leaving any breadcrumbs behind, covering their tracks, or sometimes just full out misleading, cyber sleuths. And it makes it really difficult for federal government and law enforcement around the world to essentially increase their cost of doing business, meaning deter them from, engaging in nefarious activities. However, I will say, without going into too much detail, there are a number of measures that the U.S. government has enacted in recent years to kind of, revisit or maybe explore the risk calculus of actually tracking down some of those nefarious actors. Um, but again, that's essentially going to be a never-ending cat and mouse game.
right.
But we are getting better at doing it. And to be honest, this is kind of a shameless plug again for information sharing with the federal government. The more information that the private sector shares with the federal government, the better insight we're going to have into the invasiveness and the extent of those threats. And by that I mean, there are constitutional limits and legal restrictions that govern what the federal government and the intelligence community can and cannot do,
Mm.
in the cyber mission space. And generally speaking, the majority of the activity that we embark in as intelligence officials is geared towards foreign targets. So when we have a nefarious actor overseas developing a tool that goes to launch it at your house of worship or your small business, we may have insight into what they're doing and what they intend to do, and we may actually know when they're going to do it. The problem is when that piece of malware, that tool, comes within a 12 nautical mile barrier of the U.S. Coastline, it's generally off limits for many of our organizations. So that information, that self-identification and reporting that your folks, share with the federal government is extremely insightful and helps us actually identify some of those campaigns and some of those actors. And, depending on which way the wind's blowing and how lucky we get, may enable us to actually increase their cost of doing business, in the cyberspace. So very long-winded answer, kind of philosophical, but short answer, yeah, it's really difficult to wrap our heads around what's going on. So
Well,
that's your
it's
defense.
comforting to know that our government is still looking at that anyway.
Oh, I can assure you, we are just beginning to really look at this. There are, no kidding, thousands of people, not just in Washington, D.C., but around the country, and not just in the federal government, but at every level of government and including the private sector, who have really, in the last several years, I'd say, really begun to digest and process how serious of a threat this is to our way of life. And fortunately, regardless of what's going on in Washington, who's in office, who does what. There is one unifying factor, and that we realize that we're contending with a common enemy, and it is literally us against the world. But we're all unified in addressing that threat and meeting it head on.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the answer.
My pleasure.
All right. Are there any other last minute questions? You can raise your hand if you'd like, or if you want to write a question. I'll wait for just a moment to see if anybody has anything. If there are any other questions, I can always come back and I can email you privately to answer those questions as well. As far as closing up today, I do want to thank everybody for coming and attending our Places of Worship forum. I am your community resource officer, so if you've got questions, you can always reach out to me. Two things that came to mind while we're having our presentation was number one, I think being aware of what type of threats are out there can assist with preventing them from affecting you. Another great resource that's out there is from the Federal Trade Commission. They have consumer alerts that talk about different scams that are going on that affect people across the nation. You can subscribe to that list and you can get emails on what type of activity is occurring. I've got myself subscribed to it so I can see what things are happening. And what I'll do is I'll send that in the email follow-up from this presentation over to everybody as well as all the other links. So that was everything that I have today. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. Thank you to our presenters for bringing this important information to our community. And everybody stay safe.